Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to this beautiful day in Minneapolis, and I'm grateful to be here with you. Thank you for taking a precious Saturday morning, and perhaps I remember as a father raising my kids. Actually, kids grew up in New York City, and they grew up as ground zero citizens because we moved into a loft 3 blocks away from where the towers used to stand. And I remember walking about those days in downtown by the Hudson River, and on Saturday mornings we had soccer leagues, and even right after 9/11, the first thing we tried to do was to bring back the soccer league. And I think it took us 3 weeks to figure out how to do this. We asked our neighboring league up in Chelsea, north about 10 miles from what Mayor Giuliani called the most expensive baseball field in America, which it was this field that was previously slotted for a housing project downtown as part of the Battery Park City housing project, and there was this temporary field, so we began to use it as a baseball field and soccer fields and ultimately hockey fields. And what happened was the downtown population of children increased, and all these schools were built, but we had no fields except for this field, and the parents, the community board, fought to keep this field from being built on, and they eventually won, and we were able to keep the field to play soccer in, and I was a soccer coach, so I remember those days, Saturday mornings. Speaking of New York, I have a show coming up in New York. Not that any of you might be in New York, who knows, you might be, but this is a very unique opening of an exhibit. These paintings, the painting that you see here is very large, 7 foot by 12 foot painting. In this exhibit, I will be exhibiting works that I did during the writing of this book, which is coming out in May. This is a pre-release version. So I had the privilege of being at Calvin Writers Festival to read some portions of it. I may refer to it as I speak about culture care as well. It's called Silence and Beauty, and the works that we will be debuting in New York City is also called Silence, or Silence and Beauty, and it will be in May. So the book will be released simultaneously, and this exhibit will open. It's open for about a month, so if you ever find yourself in New York City, please come and visit us. So the conversation we have today about the church and culture and the role of beauty in both. The film gave you a glimpse into my theology of beauty, and as I begin to think about the future of the church and how we can communicate the good news and what that means, what is the gospel that the world needs, and we have been called to steward and to become that message ourselves. I would say that we are God's artworks, created in Christ Jesus to be God's masterpieces. My version of Ephesians 2:8-10. And so my definition of worship, my definition of how we need to become as communities of followers of Christ, is that we need to be transformed into this beautiful artworks ourselves. And as communities, the church is this bride of Christ, beautiful, to be prepared for a cosmic wedding to come. And so the question we might ask ourselves is, how beautiful are we? And are we ready for this wedding? I say that Christians are wedding planners. And if you're planning for a wedding, you think about all the facets, right, of what is to come. You're obviously thinking about the bride and the bridegroom. And you're thinking about how we might prepare that day to celebrate their union in marriage. And when you think about that, you cannot plan a wedding without the arts. In fact, all of the art forms are present in the wedding, isn't it? Fashion, graphic design, art, dance, perhaps even theater, perhaps even a gourmet chef coming along. We must celebrate with all of the facets of human experience. So we prepare. And we ask who among this community is the best at playing that music that the bride wants or the bridegroom wants. Who can say the most authentic message, give the most authentic message? Who is prepared for this task of designing, playing the organ? And when we think about that, I as an artist and as someone who cares about excellence in expression, I've often wondered to myself, would God, for his wedding, who would he choose to play that cello piece by Bach? Would it be Yo-Yo Ma? Rostropovich? I don't know. Would he even care that a person is a follower of Christ? I don't know the answer to that question. But I know God cares about excellence, and I know God will choose the right person. But I often wonder about our preparedness for that day. As an artist, I want to be the best that I can. And it's not just ambition to say that I am comparing myself to the greatest artist that humankind has known. Yes, I stand in front of Michelangelo's and Da Vinci's and shudder because their gifts are, I know, far beyond mine. But at the same time, I also know I have been given the slice of expression to cultivate what God has given me, to do the best I can in the remaining days on earth. And that this is not just vain ambition, but this is for preparation of that day. That I don't really know where I stand. But I trust that God will have a place for me if I am faithful to the task of preparing for that day. And no matter where I stand on the scale of excellence, I know that if I can prepare myself, not only God will invite me to be part of that day, I know that for sure as his child, but I also know that things that I have done in my attempt to be faithful is going to count. It's going to be part of what God will want in this cosmic celebration. Think about that as we labor to work, even for those of us who are not cursed to be artists. even those of us who think of ourselves, like my wife, she's a psychotherapist, and said I only draw stick figures. They're wonderful stick figures, by the way. You should see them. They're full of life and joy and everything that she wants her clients to have. But how are we doing? How are we doing in preparing for this cosmic wedding? All of us, artists, entrepreneurs, mothers and fathers, coaches. Does faith matter in things that we do? Ordinary things. Does our faith speak to even the mundane? Washing dishes, taking out the garbage, stopping to give a greeting to a little boy in a wheelchair. Does those things matter? To speak to the homeless, to speak to each other with kindness instead of this polarized, divisive language that we call culture wars. I was recently at a Christian college, and I was having conversation with students, and I asked them if they knew what culture war was. And many of them said, I never heard of it. I said, praise God, maybe we're into a new season. But the problem is, you cannot avoid this today, because everything we see in media, the idol of media, is this gusher erupting out of the fissures of cultural wars built up from many, many years, last 30 years, really. And sociologist James Davison Hunter had identified this term, cultural wars, in the 80s. And his book, Cultural Wars, came out, and he's a friend of mine, so he told me how surprised he was that this term stuck in the mainstream culture and the media. In the book Culture Wars, if you read that book, you will see that James Hunter accurately predicts what's going to happen, especially in the political climates. That in the days to come, I believe he wrote this in early 80s. In the days to come, we will not be able to speak to each other. The language of polarization will take over, so much so that the left and the right will not only be able to speak to each other, but the language itself will be decimated. And he warns us toward this path. If we keep going like this, there will be no democracy left. How right he was. So what we're experiencing in culture is very much part of this conversation about beauty. And you might wonder, if you're not an artist or if you haven't thought about these issues that much, what does beauty have to do with anything? It's like, this is just a peripheral conversation. It's not. It's kind of a nice Saturday morning conversation, perhaps. Arts, well, that's good. We should have them. But, the bottom line is that we have to survive, right? You have to make a living. If you're going to send your children, they better go to get a practical degree so they can graduate and get a job. Well, sure. Education should do at least that. But we do not dare live in the logic of that argument. To say that we as human beings and we as culture, we as civilization, is only about bottom line mechanism of survival. And as James Hunter correctly identified, we really cannot talk to each other today anymore. We do not know people. And we have to remember that Jesus called us to love our enemies. How do we do that today? And so I posit, in the last 15 years, I have been speaking about these issues of changing a metaphor from culture wars to culture care. Because culture is not a war to win. It is instead an ecosystem to steward. It's a garden to tend to. Culture is something you nurture in us. There's no we versus them. Culture is us. So Christians have been this tendency to see culture as out there. You know, we have to engage with culture, which is a war word, because it's out there. We have to, it used to be that I hear many conferences that take about taking over culture, reclaiming culture. Okay, but culture is us. What's happening inside of us, in our homes, in our schools, in our minds, and in our hearts and in our imaginations? We are creating things all the time. God made us to be creative. God made us to be makers, so we are creating things all the time. And you might be wondering, well, I'm not an artist. I don't create anything. Okay. I don't use my imagination. I don't have imagination. Perhaps some people said that to me. I was like, really? Okay, here's a test. By the time you got into your car this morning and drove to this church, didn't you use your imagination to fear out of your anxious thoughts these thoughts that you're struggling with, that something may happen today to me or my children or my loved ones? Didn't we engage in this imaginative activity to maybe amplify the fears that we have for the future? Are we not concerned? That is an act of imagination. That is an act of making. We use our imaginations most of the time, and media makes this really, really, they actually captivate the fear mechanisms, right? So they amplify this. Every time we turn on the news, every time we read the papers, even Facebook postings, we are beginning to train our imagination only toward the fear and anxiety mechanisms. And culture wars language is built on this. So the problem is Christians tend to be the people who use fear as the main mechanism to raise money. It's a power struggle that began, that James Hunter identified as a sociologist very early on. So we kind of fed into this stream of creating fear and anxiety so that we can gain power, gain more audience out there for what we want to say, good things that we want to say, but the language we used is about fear. So we've been trained in this, immersed in this for generations. Artists are creatures that in the black and white world see color. And in my case, seeing color means that I'm pulverizing these beautiful rocks, minerals, from all over the world, but refined in Japan. The shop owners in Japanese Nihonga shops have these minerals lined up, and they they're designed to serve the ecosystem of culture that way, to help an artist articulate his or her vision to the world. So they literally mix paint for you. And there's a lot of adjustment that you can make. So you go to your studio, and you can begin on a morning like this. I'll be in my studio in Princeton, or in Pasadena now. I go back and forth. And start mixing the colors that I will be using that day, particularly for particular painting, particular for that day. Because depending on the moisture level that is in the air, whether it rained the last few days or not, if it's dry like in Pasadena, I have to mix the pigments differently, otherwise they'll crack when I layer them. So I'm constantly working. I'm here in Minnesota, but I'm like, sensing the air, right? I'm feeling that, okay, so my azurite pulverized to 14 level. They have these levels of gradation, coarseness. It's like coffee. And grinding them and pulverizing them and then mixing them. And what kind of glue would I use if I were to paint today in this climate? How would my glue be melting in my double kind of fondue pot that I use to melt them? It's like a cooking show. You have all these sorts of devices, and you prepare for the next step way ahead of time. And I call it slow art, because it is slow. The layers take hours to dry, and so I have to be patient, waiting for paintings to reveal themselves during the day, and I'm writing during the time that is, watching my paintings dry. And so this is a process of slowly but looking at things and looking for things and responding to what I see in front of me. And a lot of times I have to be faithful to the materials. I have my own vision on what I want to see happen, but really it is the materials that's determining the next steps. And because I love these materials and I have gotten to know them well, that they speak to me and they inform me of what is happening in the weather of the climate you're in, but also the weather inside. They respond to what's going on. I cannot lie when I'm painting. So my imagination and my hands are going into the materials, the strokes that I do every day for last 30 years. I began to just understand how sensitive these materials can be. And so I'm also using gold and silver and platinum and these precious minerals. And I often, as you saw in the film, I think about Mary, who brought that jar of nard, about a year worth wages. It is said, it is noted that they were supposed to save this for their wedding day. And so whatever it may be today, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 worth of perfume that she just broke open, and because she knew that Jesus was the Messiah, he was the one who came to save her and her brother Lazarus, but that was only the beginning of what happened at the tomb, right? She knew, she intuited all this as an artist. And her extravagant pouring of materials So these are expensive materials, but I know that throughout ages, artists always gotten the best materials, from Michelangelo to Da Vinci to Van Gogh, who had no money. He convinced his brother to buy the best materials possible, because we know instinctively as artists we have to give our best. And so we do what we can, even though it may be sacrifice, it may be impossible. And I tell people all the time that, I've lived an impossible life. And I am a proof that God is an artist, that He cares about things of the world that is gratuitous and extravagant. That He cares about things that fall into the margins, spills over into the margins. That Jesus Himself, as He told Mary, that she has done a good thing to me. And whenever the gospel is told, what she has done will also be told. This is Mark 14. That one of the greatest commendations that anybody's received in the Bible was given to this artist, Mary, who broke open that nard, spilled it in front of Jesus to anoint Him for His burial. So I think about Mary, and I think about the centurion who came and pierced Jesus' side. He would have detected this aroma too, Mary's perfume. In fact, the only thing Jesus wore to the cross was Mary's perfume. Because He knew this was going to be a wedding. Mary knew that too. Even in death, as He went down into the depth of hell, Jesus carried that aroma of Mary that later Paul calls aroma of Christ. And for many, that was the aroma of death. But for those of us who are tuned to the climate of our souls, we can see more than that. Culture care came about. Meditating, I was on the National Council, traveling around U.S., representing U.S. agencies in the arts, traveling abroad to China, and I was part of a group that went over to reintroduce U.S. as a UNESCO country with the First Lady in Paris. And as I began to travel and talk about the arts in U.S. and advocate for artists and arts organizations, I saw several things. One greatest mentor to me is a man named Dana Gioia, who was the chair of National Endowment for the Arts, who came into to Washington in 2003 before I was appointed on a national council. Dana Gioia is a poet. He's the California Poet Laureate this year. And I just saw him in Pasadena. I hosted him in a conversation at Fuller Seminary. Dana is also a former executive, business executive. He works for General Foods. And he wrote poetry late at night after he came home, dead tired. He talks about those days. And for those of you who are poets and writers and artists, he calls what he did during those times, working 9 to 9, and he had young children at home, and the only time he could write was It's from midnight to 2 a.m. He would come home dead tired. Every time he willed himself to make himself sit down at his writing desk, dedicated to his writing. This is important. You need to have a place dedicated to your craft. And forced himself to write down the last stanza that he was working on, to copy it. Simply copy that last stanza. And soon, he said, the second wind will kick in. And he would begin to work for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half before he fell asleep. This is how he wrote, and his book was nominated for the National Book Award, and he realized his colleagues, his people who were working for him, they realized their boss was a poet. And so Dana came into Washington, D.C. As quote, I was appointed as the sacrificial lamb offering to the altar of culture wars by the Bush administration. Everybody wanted to eliminate the agency. And you probably heard this argument. So he began one by one, and I became a National Council member around later that year. So I accompanied him to senators' offices and House members and leaders in Washington, D.C. One by one, he would go visit. He would do the homework. And he'll go to this senator from Colorado, who's a conservative, arch enemy of NEA. He was leading in its charge to eliminate the agency. And Dana found out that this senator was in a Shakespeare troupe in high school. So he brought his packet of Shakespeare in American communities programming that NEA was hosting, and he invited the senator into that, and he said, well, actually, I have one more request for you. Would you read Macbeth with us? And the senator agreed. Go to the opposite end of the aisle, this liberal senator from Rhode Island. We also found out he was in a Shakespeare troupe in high school. We said, would you come and read Macbeth with us? And he agreed. We put those two arch enemies together in a single room, dressed up in Shakespearean costumes. And Macbeth is a perfect script, because you get to murder each other and you get to... And at the end of the day, they were hugging each other. They remembered what was laying dormant in their lives, and all of them, without exception, we realized when it came to remembering what they did in jazz troops and band, walking in bands, playing in Shakespeare troops, they often will say, with tears in their eyes, they say, that teacher transformed my life. You see, these are people who somehow got the vision for the idealism of being in politics, right? That debate teacher, that Shakespeare acting coach or teacher, that one person that reshaped their imagination. And we don't have to fight the battle to save NEA. All we had to do was help people remember what became of their vision, right? And who influenced that vision. And so I learned a lot from Dana, and as my editor for my first book, Refractions, and we were talking about this time, and I said, I began to call what he does culture care. In the midst of cultural wars, he called this truce. He literally had an influence in the hardest place in the world to have influence, in Washington, D.C. that he quelled the storm of culture wars. And instead of fighting, they became makers together. Right? We saw this over and over again, and I began to think about, okay, so is it possible to create an antidote to culture wars instead of looking at culture as culture, something to be fought over, a territory to be fought over? Looking at culture as an ecosystem. Dana is this poet gardener who walked into this poisonous, tainted land and began one by one with hard work, 24/7, he would go and till the soil of culture until it produced fruits again. And so I saw this over and over for 6 years. And at the end of it, I began to write a culture care book based on many of the stories, many of the wisdoms gained from that experience, and thinking about reality of nature, integration of nature and culture. So what we have learned about environmental stewardship, we can almost directly apply to culture as an ecosystem. So I began to do this in my mind, and that's why this image, there's a black river. And I want to read you a passage from this book, Culture Care. And how much time do we have? Are we okay until 10:40, something like that? Do I have? I just want to gauge how I'm doing. Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll do Q&A later, right? So okay. So let me read you a portion of Culture Care just to give you an idea. And this chapter is called Custodians of Culture Care. And as I said, I used to live, Murray Street, downtown New York, and in 3 blocks away from where the tower stood. I faced Ground Zero every day as I went home, and but the fortunate thing is the Hudson River is right nearby, and I ended up thinking about the Hudson often. And this is the story of the Hudson River and why the river is black. There was a time when industrial map makers made maps. This is in 1950s. And they painted the Hudson black. And that was supposed to be a good sign. They said that we want to paint every river black because that meant that the industrialization is at its fullest capacity. And we kind of shudder today. So what happened between that perception of nature as a part of this commoditized industrial world and nature as something we need to steward? There was a shift, and this is part of that story. In the early 1960s, Fred Dambach came home from the Korean War to work at Anaconda Wire and Cable, a copper wire factory in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, 30 miles north of Manhattan. It was a booming enterprise. But he soon became troubled by what he saw at the factory. To restore beauty to the river he had grown up with, Dambach became a whistleblower against his own company. In a PBS interview with Bill Moyers, Dambach said, quote, "I have seen all kinds of oil and sulfuric acid copper filings. My gosh, they were coming out of that company like it was going out of style," end quote. He said that shad fishermen started to lose their business because there was oil in the water and they would cause the fish to be contaminated with it. and the Fulton Market refused to take their weekly catch, Anaconda and other businesses were polluting the river and hurting a second business, he said, Fred, the shad fishermen. I didn't think they had the right to do that. It used to really infuriate me. I became obsessed with fighting pollution. Fred complained to the managers about his fisherman friend's plight. Each time he did, he got demoted. He ended up being a custodian. The bottom rank. But Fred never gave up. He worked in the custodian role, literally pushing his broom into every room of the company. He also took copious notes and made maps of the company. What was intended as a punishment ended up as the best possible opportunity to spy on the company. He had all the keys. There were few pollution laws at the time. This is before the environmental movement began. Fred and a few other pioneers of the environmental movement decided to sue Anaconda under an archaic law called the Refuse Act of 1899, which Fred found while cleaning the local library. In 1972, when the U.S. Attorney's Office found a way to prosecute Anaconda, they used Fred's maps and his notes as evidence. They said this: the company was fined $200,000 under the Refuse Act of 1899. And this act, by the way, is this archaic law because the ships were coming into the harbor and dumping furniture over. So they created a law that you cannot dump anything but human waste into the river. And Fred called his friend in Washington and said, hey, is this law still in effect? And his friend did the research and came back and said, as far as we know, it hasn't been repealed. They said even today, for a polluter to be fined $200,000 is a big event. But back in the early 1970s, it was a huge event. It was like a thunderclap. Today, I'm happy to report, this month, and next month, in May, 3 million striped bass go up and down the Hudson River. They're back. Principally because Fred's effort to lead the change in the laws of the land. So I draw 3 lessons from culture care from this story. We need to be willing to sacrifice, we need to remember our first love, and we need to be taking copious notes. First, culture care requires sacrifice. We need to be willing to endure the emotions in order to become the custodians of culture care. Artists, I know that when you go out into the world of art world and gallery world, if you say anything about your faith, you're gonna get yourself in trouble. You will be demoted. But that's okay. By being demoted for the right reasons, we may be given a humble authority, which can work like keys to unlock doors of cultural factories, giving us opportunities to help clean up and to see what is really going on behind the scenes. Our keys are humility, integrity, determination, and hope for things to come. in the current art world in which ego, selfishness, and self-destructiveness abound, we will stand out eventually if we have an ounce of human decency and generosity. What if we are willing to serve someone rather than just do art for self-expression? What if we collaborated in humility and gave ourselves in service, not expecting the world or our audience to agree with us or to applaud us? Second, we need to remember our first love. Bill Moyer asked Fred Dambeck, "What kept you going?" Fred replied, "I love that river. It's a beautiful river. Look at it. It's your river. It's my river. It belongs to everybody. Who's got the right to mess it up?" That's the way I feel about it. I still do to this day. So his memory of that beautiful river kept him going through a long struggle. He had 5 children. He kept on getting demoted. He had to get extra jobs. Kept going. What keeps us going? Do we keep our first love in focus? Or have we become distracted by the need for survival? Your first love as an artist may have been revealed when you drew something on paper that came alive to you. Or perhaps you were playing a character in a school play and you realized you had entered another person's world, a world you never knew existed. Or perhaps as a dancer you made a single leap that seemed to defy gravity. A first love for creative catalyst may have been when a song began to burn deep within you as a teen. Or when you encountered a painting that you had to keep going back to. As something in that work kept opening up new vistas for you. One way to approach the rediscovery of our first love may be by considering the contrast. What is now causing you to lose hope? Because artists and creative folks are gifted receptors, sensitive to the world's woes, we may be the first to internalize and to be in despair. It is this first love that can recognize a world that is not supposed to be. If we forget it, we will end up being swallowed up in a polluted river and lose our vision for making art and possibly even to live. Third, we need to take copious notes. Just like Fred Dambeck, we need to fulfill our responsibilities as custodians of culture. Cleaning where we can, of course, but we can also use new keys to unlock the workrooms of cultural production. We can take notes to show people the flawed practices that flow out of the cultural pollutants to see if these can be identified and addressed. Now, remember what I said about the black map. We're doing the same thing in cultural industries today. We see the pollution and we see what is gushing out of the industry and we call that good. We are painting the cultural rivers black today. Same thing. We have to start changing the map, our vision, the ideals and hopes for the future generation. Remember, it is a beautiful river. No one's got the right to mess it up. Fred was not an artist, but many readers of this book are. Our notebooks should be filled with drawings, with color and fantastic designs. We are gifted with creativity and expression. Our notes should be beautiful, good, and true. Stewardship of culture and stewardship of nature go side by side. The activity of the arts are acts of stewardship. Many people see the arts and entertainment as enemies, or at least view them with healthy suspicion, and not without cause. Many recent expressions of the arts have twisted the good, true, and the beautiful. In the same way, we have polluted our rivers. The arts are always upstream of culture, and artists are the creators of culture. The question is, how do we enact change? So I stopped there without giving answer to my own question, just to tease you and say, please buy my book. By the way, every dime of this book goes back into culture care work. I self-publish it. I don't want to go through a publisher because I want this to be a grassroots movement, and it is supposed to go right back into the work of culture care. So please support that work as well, and thank you very much.
So we're going to take a break here. We're going to reconvene at 10:50. I'm going to give you permission to ask one another this question. And the question is, what pops into your mind when you, what domain, what little slice of culture pops into your mind when you hear about this duty to steward culture? So that might be a living room. That could be a neighborhood. That could be so many things. But I give you permission, ask a stranger. So we'll reconvene at 10:50 right here. Thanks.